The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty streets of La Junta, Colorado Territory, as Victor Caldwell knelt before the fresh mound of earth that held his heart. His weathered hands trembled as he placed a single wild columbine atop the simple wooden cross bearing the name Amelia Caldwell, beloved wife, 1849–1876. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh soil and the distant calls of meadowlarks, but Victor heard nothing save the deafening silence of her absence. It had been 1 month since the consumption took her. 1 month since he'd watched the light fade from those emerald eyes that had captured his soul 7 years prior. Victor removed his hat, the same worn Stetson he'd worn the day they'd met, and ran his calloused fingers through hair that seemed to have grayed overnight. "I promised you wildflowers, Amelia," he whispered, his voice catching. "Every week until the grass grows. And even then, I reckon I'll keep coming." The year was 1876, and Victor Caldwell, at 32, felt like an old man as he rose stiffly from his knees. The small cemetery on the hill overlooked the fledgling town of La Junta, where the Arkansas River curved gently through the Colorado plains. It was a new town, barely 5 years old, growing alongside the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. Victor and Amelia had arrived among the first settlers, dreaming of building a ranch and a family. Now only one of those dreams remained, and without her, even that felt hollow. Victor replaced his hat and walked toward his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Copper. The animal nuzzled his shoulder as if sensing his grief. As Victor approached, he noticed a horse he didn't recognize tied at the hitching post. A bay mare with a white blaze down its face stood patiently, its saddlebags bulging with what appeared to be supplies. "Hello," Victor called as he dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the Colt revolver at his hip. Strangers weren't uncommon in these parts, but caution had become second nature. The cabin door opened, and Thomas stepped out, followed by a woman Victor had never seen before. She wore a simple traveling dress, dusty from the trail, her honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. She couldn't have been more than 25. "Mr. Caldwell," Thomas said, nervously twisting his hat in his hands. "This here is Miss Abigail Northcott. She's come from Denver. Says she's—" "I'm Amelia's sister," the woman interjected, stepping forward with a directness that momentarily stunned Victor. "I received word of her passing 3 weeks ago. I came as soon as I could arrange my affairs." Victor stared at the woman, searching for traces of Amelia in her features. The eyes, he realized they shared the same shade of green, though Abigail's lacked the laugh lines that had framed Amelia's. Her jaw was more determined, her posture straighter. "I didn't know Amelia had a sister," Victor said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Abigail's expression tightened. "No, you wouldn't. We lost touch some years ago. A disagreement that seems foolish now." She swallowed hard. May I see where she's buried?" The request, so simple and heartfelt, broke through Victor's initial suspicion. He nodded once. "Tomorrow. It'll be dark soon, and the trail can be treacherous if you don't know it." He glanced at Thomas. "She can take Amelia's room for the night." Thomas nodded and excused himself to tend to the evening chores, leaving Victor and Abigail in uncomfortable silence. "I should have come sooner," Abigail said finally, "when she wrote that she'd married." Victor's head snapped up. "She wrote to you?" Abigail reached into her pocket and withdrew a small bundle of letters, worn at the edges from frequent handling. "Not often, perhaps once a year. But she spoke of you with great affection, Mr. Caldwell." "Victor," he corrected automatically, then gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside, Miss Northcott. You must be tired from your journey." The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, and a small kitchen area. 2 doors led to separate bedrooms. Everything was neat, but there were signs of neglect: dust on the mantelpiece, unwashed dishes in a basin. "I apologize for the state of things," Victor said, suddenly seeing his home through a stranger's eyes. "Since Amelia." "Please," Abigail said softly. "No apologies necessary." She moved to the fireplace, where a daguerreotype stood in a simple wooden frame. Victor and Amelia on their wedding day. Her white dress simple but elegant, his face younger and unburdened by grief. "She looked happy," Abigail murmured, touching the frame lightly. "She was," Victor replied, his throat tightening. "We both were." That night, after a simple meal of salt pork and beans, Victor sat on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. The doctor from Pueblo came twice, but said there was nothing to be done except make her comfortable. Was she in pain? At the end, yes, but she never complained. That wasn't her way. Victor's voice cracked. She worried about me, even then, made me promise I wouldn't become a hermit. Said I should plant flowers on her grave until the grass grew, to give me a reason to keep living. Abigail's quiet tears reflected the moonlight. "That sounds like my sister, always thinking of others." She knelt, placing her hand on the freshly turned earth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Victor remained a respectful distance away, understanding the private nature of grief. After several minutes, Abigail rose and approached him, her eyes red but her voice steady. "The wildflowers you mentioned, the ones you promised to bring. What kind were they?" "Whatever's blooming," Victor replied. Amelia wasn't particular. She loved them all: prairie coneflowers, penstemons, blue flax. She said each one had its own story to tell. Abigail nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "We argued, said things we shouldn't have." She sighed. "I left alone, too proud to write for almost 2 years. By then, she'd sold the farm and moved west herself. To Kansas," Victor supplied. "That's where I met her, working as a cook at a way station along the cattle drive." "She wrote about that," Abigail said. "Said a handsome cowboy with kind eyes asked her to dance at a social, and she knew right then she'd marry him." Victor felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Wasn't quite that simple. Took me 3 months of courting to convince her I was serious." "I should turn in," she said, rising from her chair. "Good night, Victor." He watched her disappear inside, cursing his inability to find the right words. The truth was, Abigail had become more than help. She'd become a friend, a confidant, someone who understood his grief because she shared it. But to admit more than that felt like a betrayal of Amelia, whose memory was still so fresh it ached. The next morning brought clear skies and the news that several cattle had broken through a fence during the storm. Victor and Thomas spent the day tracking and retrieving the wayward animals, returning to the ranch exhausted as the sun began to set. The aroma of fresh bread and stewing meat greeted them, and Victor found Abigail in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her forearms. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, not meeting his eyes directly. "It's venison stew. A hunter from town traded the meat for some of our eggs." Victor nodded his thanks, suddenly aware of how domestic the scene was, how right it felt to come home to her at the end of a long day. That night, after Thomas had retired to the small bunkhouse and they were alone, Victor cleared his throat. "About what you asked last night." Abigail looked up from the shirt she was mending, one of his that had torn during the day's work. "You don't need to explain yourself, Victor." I spoke out of turn. "No," he insisted gently. "You didn't. I don't rightly know what to say. Amelia's only been gone 3 months. Feels wrong to." "To what?" Abigail prompted when he trailed off. "To admit I've come to care for you," Victor finished, the words leaving him in a rush. "She said you were too stubborn to admit when you needed help, too loyal to look for companionship even when she was gone. Victor felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. She knew. She knew she was dying, Abigail confirmed. And she knew you. Better than you know yourself, I think. Victor stood abruptly, moving to the window to hide the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Outside, the moon illuminated the landscape in silver, the same moon that had witnessed his promise to Amelia as she lay dying. The following Sunday, as they placed fresh columbines on Amelia's grave, Victor noticed the grass was growing thicker now, spreading across the once bare earth in vibrant green patches. It's taking root, Abigail observed, her hand lightly touching the emerging blades. Victor nodded, feeling something shift within him. She loved watching things grow, said there was hope in every new shoot. As summer progressed, so did the tentative relationship between Victor and Abigail. There were no grand declarations or sudden passions, only the slow, steady growth of something genuine. They continued their Sunday visits to the cemetery, but now they sometimes lingered in town afterward, attending socials or simply walking along the increasingly bustling streets of La Junta. The townspeople, who had treated Victor with cautious sympathy after Amelia's death, began to regard him and Abigail with knowing smiles. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store, went so far as to comment on what a fine couple they made when Abigail came in for supplies. "I'm just helping out at the ranch," Abigail had replied, her cheeks coloring. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Peterson had said with a wink. Neighbors arrived to help, bringing water barrels and additional hands. By midday, the immediate danger had passed, but a quarter of Victor's grazing land was charred black, and 3 cattle had been lost to the flames. Exhausted and smoke-stained, he slumped against the barn, surveying the damage. Abigail approached, carrying a ladle of water. Her dress was smudged with soot, her hair escaping its pins, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Drink," she ordered, holding the ladle to his lips. Victor obeyed, the cool water soothing his parched throat. "Could have been worse," he rasped. "About what you said. About Amelia wanting us to help each other heal." Abigail turned to him, her face ghostly in the moonlight. And I think she'd be mighty vexed with me for being so slow to recognize a blessing when it's right in front of me." He reached out, tentatively taking Abigail's hand in his. "I don't want you to go back to Denver, Abigail. Not unless that's truly what you want." Her fingers tightened around his. "What are you asking, Victor Caldwell?" "I'm asking if you might consider staying. Permanently." He swallowed hard. "Not as my sister-in-law or my helper, but as my wife. In time when it's proper." Abigail was silent for so long that Victor began to fear he'd misread the situation entirely. Then she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his cheek. "I would consider that," she whispered, "very favorably." The kiss was chaste, barely more than a breath against his skin, but it sent warmth spreading through Victor's chest for the first time in months. Not the burning passion he'd felt for Amelia in their early days, but something steadier, more grounded, like the deep roots of prairie grass that could withstand both drought and fire. As summer gave way to autumn, Victor and Abigail's relationship deepened. They continued their weekly visits to Amelia's grave, now fully covered with thick grass interspersed with wildflowers that had taken seed from their offerings. They still brought fresh blooms each Sunday, but the ritual had transformed from an obligation born of grief to a celebration of remembrance. The town began treating them as a courting couple, inviting them together to harvest festivals and barn raisings. Abigail's deft hand with a needle and her patient way with children earned her the respect of the community's women, while her surprisingly accurate aim with a rifle during a turkey shoot impressed the men. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Victor had asked, amazed when she outscored all but the town's sheriff. Abigail had smiled enigmatically. "Father believed daughters should be as capable as sons." said you never know when you might need to defend yourself in this world. In October, as the aspens turned golden and the first frost threatened, Abigail received a letter from Denver. The school board where she had taught was inquiring about her extended absence and whether they should permanently fill her position. They need an answer by month's end, she said, showing Victor the letter as they sat at the kitchen table after supper. I've already been gone far longer than I initially planned. Victor studied her face, searching for clues to her thoughts. What do you want to do? I'm not sure teaching was ever my true calling, she admitted. I enjoyed it well enough, but it was a means to support myself, not a passion. She hesitated. But I found I love the land here, the openness of it, the challenge. And the company? Victor asked, his heart beating faster. Abigail smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. The company most of all. That night, Victor retrieved a small box from beneath a floorboard in his bedroom, a hiding place Amelia had never discovered, where he'd kept her Christmas and birthday presents over the years. Inside was a simple gold band with a small pearl setting the engagement ring he'd purchased for Amelia 7 years earlier. He turned it over in his palm, memories washing over him. Amelia's delighted gasp when he'd presented it, the way it had caught the lamplight as she'd extended her hand to admire it, the weight of it in his hand when he'd removed it from her cold finger before burial. The thought of offering it to Abigail felt wrong somehow, as if he would be replacing one sister with another. Yet keeping it hidden away seemed equally wrong, a denial of the love that had existed, that still existed in memory. After a sleepless night, Victor rode into town the next morning. At the jeweler's shop, a recent addition to La Junta's growing business district, he selected a different ring. This one was gold as well, but set with a small blue sapphire that reminded him of the forget-me-nots they'd placed on Amelia's grave. For Miss Northcote, I presume? The jeweler asked with a knowing smile as he wrapped the purchase. Abigail Northcote, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his stomach. I believe with all my heart that Amelia sent you to me. Not to replace her, no one could ever do that, but to remind me that life is for the living, and love doesn't diminish when it's shared. He withdrew the small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal the sapphire ring. I'm asking you to stay, not as Amelia's sister or my helper, but as my wife, to build something new together while honoring what came before. Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks as she looked from the ring to Victor's face, then to her sister's grave. She would approve, wouldn't she? She whispered. I believe she orchestrated it, Victor replied, his own vision blurring. That stubborn woman never could stand to leave a problem unsolved. Abigail laughed through her tears, nodding. Yes, Victor Caldwell, I will marry you, here with Amelia's blessing. At the celebration that followed, held in the town hall, the couple received congratulations and well wishes from friends and neighbors. Several people quietly mentioned how pleased Amelia would be, and neither Victor nor Abigail corrected them. They both felt her presence that day not as a ghost or a shadow, but as a benevolent force that had guided them together. Before returning to the ranch, they made a brief stop at the cemetery, where Victor placed his wedding boutonniere against Amelia's cross. Thank you, he whispered to the winter wind, for everything you were, and everything you knew I would need. Abigail stood slightly apart, giving him this moment of private farewell. When he rejoined her, taking her gloved hand in his, she asked, Will we still come every week? Victor considered the question. Perhaps not every week, he said finally, but often enough to remember, but not to dwell in grief. I think she'd understand that. Abigail nodded, squeezing his hand. I believe she would. Winter settled over the Colorado plains, blanketing the ranch in snow and ice. The newlyweds found their rhythm together, learning the intricate dance of marriage, when to speak, when to listen, when to hold fast, and when to yield. They were not without disagreements, but they faced them with the maturity of those who had known loss and understood the precious nature of time. In the evenings, they often sat before the fire, Abigail sewing or reading aloud from one of the books she'd brought from Denver, Victor whittling or repairing tack. Sometimes they spoke of Amelia sharing memories, filling in gaps in each other's knowledge of her life. Other times they spoke of the future improvements to the ranch, plans for expanding the herd, the possibility of children. On the coldest nights, as wind howled across the prairie and snow piled against the cabin walls, they found warmth in each other's arms, discovering the unique pleasure of their union. Abigail's passion surprised Victor. Beneath her composed exterior lay a woman of deep feeling and uninhibited response. For his part, Victor brought a tenderness to their lovemaking that moved Abigail to tears more than once. "I never expected this," she confessed one night as they lay entwined beneath heavy quilts, the fire burning low in the grate. "When I came here, I thought only to pay my respects to Amelia, perhaps help you for a brief time before returning to my life." Victor traced the curve of her cheek in the firelight. "And I never expected to find love again. Certainly not with my wife's sister." Abigail smiled at the term. "Does it still feel strange to you, calling me your wife?" "Not strange," Victor mused. "Different, like a song played in a new key, familiar yet distinct." He pulled her closer. Victor dropped to his knees before her chair, placing his large, work-roughened hand over hers. "A child," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Amelia and we tried, but it never happened for us." "I know," Abigail said softly. "She mentioned it in her letters. It was a great sorrow to her." Victor pressed his lips to Abigail's hand. "She would be so happy for us, for this new life." The pregnancy progressed well through the summer and into autumn. Abigail remained active on the ranch, though Victor insisted on hiring an additional hand to take over the heavier chores she had been managing. When they did go, they would sit beside the now lush mound, speaking to Amelia as if she could hear them telling her about ranch happenings, the changing seasons, the coming child. "We're thinking of naming the baby after you, if it's a girl," Abigail told her sisters grave one crisp October afternoon. "Amelia Victoria Caldwell. What do you think?" The only answer was the rustling of prairie grass in the autumn breeze, but both Victor and Abigail felt a sense of peaceful approval. On the first day of November, as the last leaves clung stubbornly to the cottonwoods and the first snow flurries danced on the wind, Abigail's labor began. Victor sent Thomas racing to town for Mrs. Thornton, while he helped Abigail to their bed and heated water as he'd been instructed to do in preparation. The hours that followed were both the longest and shortest of Victor's life. He paced outside the bedroom door, occasionally allowed in to wipe Abigail's brow or hold her hand through a particularly difficult contraction. "Mrs." When he was finally allowed into the room, he found Abigail propped up against pillows, tired but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice hoarse from the exertion of labor but filled with wonder. Victor approached cautiously, almost afraid to believe this miracle was real. The infant's face was red and wrinkled, a tuft of dark hair plastered to his tiny head, his eyes squeezed shut against the newness of everything. "He's perfect," Victor breathed, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. "Vincent Thomas Caldwell, for Thomas who has been such a help to us." The first weeks of Vincent's life passed in a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and precious moments of discovery. Victor found himself fascinated by the tiny perfection of his son's fingers and toes, the changing expressions that flitted across his face during sleep, the surprising strength of his grip when he curled his hand around Victor's finger. Winter settled over the ranch, bringing with it a peaceful isolation. The three of them, four, counting Thomas, who had become like family, formed their own small world, protected from the harsh elements by the sturdy walls of the cabin and the warmth of the hearth. On Christmas morning, despite the bitter cold, Victor insisted on bundling Abigail and Vincent in multiple layers for a short journey. "Where are we going?" Abigail asked as he hitched the team to the sleigh, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You'll see," Victor replied with a secretive smile. The sleigh runners cut through the fresh snow with a satisfying hiss as the horses pulled them toward town. But instead of continuing to La Junta, Victor turned up the path to the cemetery on the hill. "Victor, it's freezing," Abigail protested, holding Vincent closer. "The baby shouldn't be out in this cold." "Just for a moment," Victor promised. "There's something we need to do." At Amelia's grave, now a gentle mound beneath a blanket of snow, Victor drew a small evergreen wreath from beneath the sleigh seat. Carefully brushing snow from the wooden cross, he hung the wreath upon it. "Merry Christmas, Amelia," he said softly. "I wanted you to meet your nephew. This is Vincent." Abigail, understanding now, moved closer with the bundled infant. "He has your smile, sister," she said. "When he's not crying or sleeping, that is." For a few minutes, they stood in the crisp silence of the winter morning, the only sounds the occasional stamp of the horse's hooves and Vincent's soft cooing from within his blankets. "Thank you," Victor said finally, addressing the grave, "for loving me, for letting me love you." But somehow, he knew he would continue to visit, to include Amelia in the life they were building, not out of obligation but out of love. Spring returned to the Colorado plains, bringing with it new life and renewed purpose. Vincent grew rapidly, developing a sunny disposition and curious nature that delighted his parents. He began crawling early, exploring every corner of the cabin with determined focus. The ranch prospered under Victor and Abigail's joint management. With the money from the previous year's cattle sales, they added a new wing to the cabin, a proper nursery for Vincent and any future siblings, plus a small study where Abigail had begun teaching reading and basic arithmetic to the children of neighboring ranchers 3 afternoons a week. On the anniversary of Amelia's death, now 2 years past, they made their pilgrimage to the cemetery. Vincent, secure in his father's arms, reached out with chubby fingers to touch the wildflowers they had brought. "Flower," he said, one of the few words in his expanding vocabulary. "That's right, son," Victor said, his throat tight with emotion. "Flowers for your Aunt Amelia." As they stood there, a family united by both love and loss, Victor reflected on the strange, winding path that had led him to this moment. The grief that had nearly broken him had also opened his heart to a new kind of love, one built not on the passionate flames of youth, but on the steady embers of mutual respect, shared sorrow, and hard-won joy. Abigail, seeming to sense his thoughts, took his hand. "She's still with us, you know," she said softly. "In Vincent's laugh. In the way the wildflowers bloom each spring. In the love we share." Victor nodded, squeezing her fingers gently. "I know, and I'm grateful every day for both of you, the wife I lost and the wife I found." As they turned to leave, Vincent babbling happily in Victor's arms, Abigail paused. "Victor," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." He raised an eyebrow, waiting. "It seems Vincent may be getting a little brother or sister come winter," she said, her free hand moving to rest on her stomach. "Mrs. Thornton confirmed it last week." Joy bloomed in Victor's chest, as vibrant and unstoppable as the wildflowers that had taken root on Amelia's grave. Life, it seemed, was determined to continue its cycle of renewal, even in the face of loss. "Amelia knew," he said with sudden certainty. "Somehow, she knew that this would be our path. That's why she made me promise to keep coming here, to keep bringing flowers until the grass grew. To keep you connected to life," Abigail agreed. "To ensure you wouldn't retreat from the world when she left it."